Welcome to Lamakaan. My name is Biju Matthew. I'm one of the members of the Executive Council of Lamakaan. And for those of you who know Lamakaan, it needs no introduction, of course. But for anybody who is here for the first time, Lamakaan's open cultural, educational, political space, and it's yours. So please come back, make whatever use you want of it, and bring programming to it. As I said, our job was to create a space. We've created it. It's for everybody who comes here to make what they want to make of it. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce the speaker of the evening, Professor Vamsi Vakulabharanam. Vamsi is a dear friend and comrade. I've known him for a very long time, and I consider him one of India's, and if not the world's, most important thinkers in terms of Marxist political economy and trying to think through some of the puzzles of our time. And I say that because I think, we are living through extremely uncertain times, both politically, certainly all of us are feeling the impacts of that right now here in India and across the globe. But in terms of the economic project of neoliberalism that opened in terms of a counter-revolutionary kind of move back in the 1980s, and now that's a that's almost a 50-year or 40-year project at this point. And so in terms of the world economy, in terms of how societies are structured, in terms of their economic base, the world has been torn asunder and put back together in ways that are extremely difficult to comprehend and has extremely impactful in terms of the lives of ordinary people. And in that context, people who do the work of thinking through that, understanding it, trying to illuminate, trying to shine that cold white light of reason onto that, I think are extremely important, and Vamsi is certainly one of them. So Vamsi is going to be the space for his talk wide open with the title of The Future of the Indian Economy. We've just seen a budget come out, so it's in that broad context of the last general election, which is today 51 days since the last general election, results came out, and in the context of the first budget of the second NDA regime. So it's in that context that these two events, the victory, the landslide victory of the Modi regime and the first budget of this second term, form the context, form the background, but of course Vamsi hopefully is going to go way beyond just a simple commentary on that. Thank you so much for being here, and let's welcome Vamsi.
Thank you, Biju. It's a pleasure to come back to Lamakaan. I was part of the founding idea. I don't take any credit for how well it has flourished. Almost 7-8 years ago, I gave a series of lectures on Marx, and I still fondly remember the conversations I had here. The broad topic that I have for today is the future of Indian economy, and this particular topic is broadly framed, and there's also a reason why this topic is a difficult topic to broach or discuss, because future is fundamentally difficult to understand and interpret, and it's hazardous to make a guess about the future. Those of you who are from economics background would know, John Maynard Keynes believed that, future is fundamentally uncertain, so, but we still make certain kinds of formulations about the future. Of course, economists don't hesitate in making, forecasts or predictions about the future. And another eminent economist from the 20th century remarked, jovially, that economists get away with predictions because only the predictions that come true are remembered, and all the predictions that go false are forgotten. So economists have a career. They still have a professional kind of way of making predictions. So what I'll do today is not in the form of making predictions. So for instance, this budget and even before the budget and after the budget, people are, talking about a $5 trillion economy in 3 years or 4 years' time. I'm not going to say anything about that. Personally, if you ask me for my opinion, I don't think it's an easy target to achieve in 3 years, but I'm not going to comment on that. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about broad tendencies, that have existed in the last few years and how they may be shaped in the coming, 5 years, coming decade or so, and especially during NDA 3, Modi 2 and NDA 3, what kind of, economic processes may be unleashed and how are we going to face them, in the Indian economy. So that will be the main focus of my talk. So I won't be dealing with particular numbers, particular forecasts, particular predictions. So one of the things that I want to start with is this whole, if you look at the recent election, the 2019 election, but also 2014 election, one of the things that has failed, there was a pattern in predicting Indian elections. There was a pattern in the way Indian elections were fought and support was generated or incumbents were pushed back. That pattern has been disturbed. And what is that pattern? If you look at the elections carefully, starting in the 60s until today, until 2014, whenever there is some kind of an economic crisis, whenever there's some kind of an economic disturbance, whenever there's a slowdown, the incumbents get pushed back. And when the economy does well, when the economy flourishes, the incumbents tend to do well, right? So you can take multiple examples of this, but going back to 1967, for instance, the first election when, there was a huge economic crisis, the first, 3 5-year plans had been completed, and Nehru had just passed away, Indira Gandhi was beginning to take over, and the economy was going through a deep crisis. There was a slowdown in industry, industrial growth, there was a big crisis in agriculture, and the result was not that the Congress was defeated, but Congress was pushed back considerably. This is the first election when Jansangh, the previous form of BJP, won several state elections. And since 1967 until 2014, every time there was an economic crisis, you can think of 1980, you can think of 1991, you can think of 1998, there are multiple examples. Whenever there's an economic crisis, the entire incumbency factor, there is an anti-incumbency factor that comes into play, and that particular pattern has been disturbed in 2014 as well as 2019. And this is a very important thing to observe, because think of 2014. I'll come to 2019 in much more detail, but think of 2014. The economy was doing quite well. The growth rate was over 6%, and there were redistributive policies, welfare regimes that were initiated during UPA 1 and UPA 2, and they actually worked, right? The National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme worked quite well. But then, UPA was defeated in 2014, bringing forth Modi's first government, NDA 2. NDA 1 is, Vajpayee's, 1998 to 2003 regime. But 2014, Modi came to power, even though the economy was doing reasonably well. So that's the first election when, this pattern is disturbed. And then you come to 2019, what happened is, you actually see that, if you look at the period between 2014 and 2019, the economy did not do all that well. Right? There's a lot of gymnastics, data gymnastics that people have talked about. There are many established and prominent economists who understand the national accounts data very well, who are arguing that, even the growth rates that we see, displayed in government websites are super inflated. The actual growth rates are much lower. People like Arvind Subramaniam, who were part of the government over the last 5 years, they've come out with accounts of how, very likely, the numbers that we are seeing around 6% growth rate is inflated. So it's not just growth. If you look at the signature policies of the, NDA government during, after Modi came to power in 2014, the two signature policies. One is demonetization. All of us are familiar with it. I left to teach in the US in 2014. When demonetization was introduced in 2016, in December I came here, I saw, several common people going through extreme economic hardship. There were old people waiting in lines in front of banks. There were pregnant women waiting in lines. This is not something that would have been, would have gone unchecked, right, if the previous pattern continued. This was a disaster. This policy was a disaster. But it also affected about 90% of Indian labor force, who are all in the informal sector. And informal sector is fundamentally cash dependent. And when you withdraw 90% of the cash in the economy, the cash dependent sector is going to, be adversely affected. And this is something that actually happened, right? So despite that, and despite the introduction of, or implementation, slightly shoddy implementation of the, GST bill, you actually saw Modi government coming back to power with a higher majority, right? So that is what is particularly puzzling about this factor. So where I want to start with is, economy is so big in our lives. I'm an economist, so, I'm actually, I'm not an economic determinist, but, I do think economy is extremely important. So the first puzzle is, economy is so central to everybody's life. Why are people ignoring the economy? How did this pattern get disturbed? Right? So that's something to engage with, something to understand, something to carefully analyze. I don't think, people have fully understood yet, the various factors that led to, this kind of a, victory, despite a faltering economy. So the point I want to make at this juncture is, a lot of people, including a lot of Marxists, they tend to be economic determinists. They believe that economic is the central driving force of the whole society, and political, cultural, and natural factors, they follow the economic factors. So you first understand the economy, the economic base, and the entire superstructure will become visible, or it will get determined by economic factors. So I want to question that. I actually believe in Marxist ideas. I consider myself a Marxist, but I'm not an economic determinist. So the first point I want to make is, I think we should be careful about being too deterministic in an economic sense. There are political and cultural factors that are crucial, and economic factors are also important. It's not just the case that, since economic factors were not decisive in the recent election, it's not the case that they're unimportant. They're extremely important, but there's no need to become determinists, economic determinists. So that's one thing. The second thing that comes out of my own description is, there's a lot of, we live in an age of data, right? All of us engage with lots of data all the time, and there is a certain empirical determinism that people have fallen into. You look at statistics, you look at data, you think, they speak the truth. You look at numbers, you think, numbers give you the truth. But if you look at the pattern, over the last 50 years and see, observe how, these patterns are changing, there is a need to think through carefully, not just using data, not just empirically, but I think we need to, think about, important ways, important ideas through which, we can make sense of what is going on, and also, to see what kind of alternatives we can propose or promote. So the first thing about this election is, the fact that economic factors, did not play a key role or a decisive role in determining the victory. Although, they probably played an important role. In a piece that I and my co-author, Shripad Motiram, we wrote a piece together showing that even in the recent election, run up to the recent election, until February, the popularity of Modi regime was actually declining, and it's only after February, after Pulwama and Balakot strikes that the popularity began to rise again. So what are the factors that actually led to that turnaround? Therefore, you also need to credit this victory to those factors, not the fact that, not the economic factors definitely, but, those other factors. And people have talked about, nationalism, Hindu nationalism. People have talked about, the scale shift, geographical factors. People vote, differently at the national level, but they vote very differently at the local level. Telangana itself, November you had an election, and KCR swept the election. It was better than even the first time, right? The number of seats that KCR won. Just a few months later, you see another election, and KCR is pushed back quite a lot. So there is a scale shift. At the national scale, people are voting in a certain way, and at the local, provincial, or state level, people are voting differently. This is also true in Karnataka. This is true in several of the Hindi-speaking states, for instance, which elected Congress governments. So there is a scale shift. There is nationalism. There's also, a lot of talk about how various welfare schemes that were introduced by Modi's government also worked, to secure, various votes. So all these factors are still open for debate. I think, we still need to understand what led to this particular, the change of pattern, also what led to this particular victory, which was quite spectacular. BJP got 37% of the vote, which is not a majority vote. We should underscore that. But still, compared to any other political party over the last 30 years, they got a higher vote. So that's quite significant. So what led to this sort of a victory? I mean, apart from these factors, nationalism, the scale shift, which is a geographical argument, or economic policies, what else do we need to make sense of? So that is something to think about carefully. But one of the interesting things about the election outcome is if economic factors don't matter, right? Is there a feedback mechanism in the overall country? Suppose, people are suffering, people are going through, hardship, economic hardship. Is there a feedback mechanism any longer? And if there is, let's say there is a feedback mechanism, the media reports on it, but then, people seem to vote not based on their hardship. So economic factors, are they decisive? Are they important anymore? So what this question raises is, economy, is it simply a floating kind of space now? In other words, can the government do whatever it wants with the economy and get away, go scot-free, and then, still hope to get elected? I think that's the juncture we are at, which is a very interesting moment. So, if the economy has, become a floating kind of space, where, economic factors don't matter, how do we think about the future of the economy? That's a tough moment, even for economists to carefully think through this moment and say, okay, what is the future trajectory of this economy? Because there's nothing that seems to be pushing the government back. The government is not really, with a faltering economy, if they come back to power with a higher majority, does the economic matter anymore? Right? So this is a key question. And I I think that, economy matters. It may not matter the same way as it used to matter earlier, but it still matters. How do we sort of think about the role of the economy? How do we think about, therefore, the future of Indian economy? Are there some anchors? Are there some guidelines? Are there some, features that we can look into in order to think through the future trajectory of the Indian economy, right? So that is what I'll spend a little bit of time on. The first anchor that we have, first indicator that we might have, is the budget that Nirmala Sitharaman presented. What can we glean from the budget? Budget, this is actually a very interesting. I didn't listen to her speech. I was traveling on that day, but I read the entire speech. The next day I printed out her speech and I read the whole speech. What immediately strikes you is, what is so different about her budget compared to UPA budgets? It's not obvious that, there is nothing, very clear that suggests that, this is a Modi budget, Modi 2 budget. It looks like any other budget. So if you go through the budget carefully, there's a lot of emphasis on infrastructure, for instance, right? It starts with infrastructure, Bharatmala, Sagarmala, all those infrastructural projects. Then it talks about the need to create domestic investment, reforms in the financial sector, generating investment, through domestic channels. It talks about generating foreign direct investment, and it congratulates the government for, generating very high levels of FDI over the last 5 years, and says that they'll continue to integrate into the globalized economy. So they're all for globalization. It's not a Swadeshi, it's not an autarkic kind of economic policy structure. It's it's a policy that, it's a budget that is promoting globalization, that wants to integrate into the globalized economy. Then there is a talk about how urban, the urban spaces in India are growth generating, and therefore, the government ought to continue with an urban growth kind of policies. And there's a talk about how, farmers need to be given various, welfare measures. And there are various schemes, populist schemes of various kinds that the budget goes into. So what's so different between, her budget and, let's say, the budget that Chidambaram presented? And this is an important question. And at some basic level, there is no difference. At some basic level, both Congress, UPA and NDA, they believe in neoliberal economic policies. They believe in the logic of markets. They believe in globalization. They believe in a growth-centric economy. And in order to address the hardships, they also believe in introducing populist policies. Right? There is no difference. But that's not the end of the story. I went back to the speech, and if you read the first paragraph of Part A, under Part A, right, which is the beginning of her speech, she says there are two goals of this government. One is economic growth, which is, again, something that they share with UPA. And the second, and this is the key point I'll make about the budget, the second is, she talks about creating something called a national society. So it's UPA budgets plus nationalism. So what is national society? If you reread the budget, speech, what you get is, there are frequent references to one nation, one grid, one nation, one price, one nation, one policy, right? One nation, one welfare scheme, right? So there is an attempt to create, a national space away from some kind of federalism, away from, the autonomy, the flexibility that different states had earlier in creating their own policies, their own spaces. That's a key distinction between UPA and NDA. And the second point I want to make about this national society formulation is, under UPA, if you look at 2004, if you look at 2009, UPA government was open to various kinds of feedback. Right? When they came to power in 2004, what did Manmohan Singh do? He did two things very prominently in the first week or 10 days after he was selected as the elected as prime minister. The first thing is he came and met farmers in Andhra Pradesh, United Andhra Pradesh at that time, where if you recall, there was a major suicide phenomenon in Telangana region. In fact, I did my PhD, my doctoral dissertation is on agrarian suicides in Telangana. So Manmohan Singh came and actually met the farmers. So, there was an attempt to connect with, economic hardship that was actually visible on the ground. Of course, the second thing that happened was, right after UPA came to power, I don't know if many people remember this, stock markets crashed. It was a deliberate attempt. People started selling. People wanted to send a signal to the government. I mean, left parties are part of your coalition, so we won't tolerate if you make very progressive policies. So stock markets crashed. So Chidambaram and Manmohan Singh immediately rushed to Bombay, and they also made statements saying, we are also going to be investment friendly. So that defines UPA for you, right? But then, there was, through the ability of UPA government to absorb some of the feedback, some of the criticism about the economic hardships on the ground, what they were able to do is, they were able to kick off a welfare regime. So UPA 1, UPA 2 kicked off a slew of welfare measures, right? Something that is very different from what they did in the 90s. Until 2004, between 1991 and 2004, after market-oriented reforms were introduced, policies were formulated in a certain way. Post 2004, you actually saw the unleashing of various kinds of welfare reforms. So that openness was there. Now, the incorporation of something like national society is an answer to that sort of openness. It's basically saying we don't have that kind of an openness anymore. We may do a few populist measures, if we want to do them, but our answer to UPA kind of openness is nationalism. Right? So the economy is now going to be a combination of growth-centric discourse and nationalism. This is absolutely new. This is very distinctive about NDA 3. Even in NDA 2, because Modi came to power saying Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, he was still focused on development, at least the first 1 or 2 years. There was some hope that, he would deliver some development goals. But this particular regime, as I pointed out, once economy becomes a floating space, the answer to hardship, the answer to the feedback mechanism is broken, and it's replaced by this particular formulation of national society. Sorry? Yeah, whatever. I mean, a particular kind of nationalism. We'll criticize that. I'll come to that in a more detailed fashion. So, this is the first anchor. Looking at the budget speech, the huge distinction between UPA and NDA is, along with growth-centered discourse, along with neoliberalism, there is a certain logic of the national space that is also being constructed, and that is going to be part of what this government is going to do in the coming 5 years, right? So the second anchor, so this is the first anchor. The second anchor from which we can draw some lessons or draw some ideas about the future trajectory of Indian economy is the Gujarat model. What happened in Gujarat? Modi was in power in Gujarat for 14 years. He was the longest serving chief minister of Gujarat between 2001 and 2014. And what kind of a model did he unleash in Gujarat? And what are the lessons that we can learn from the Gujarat model? So there are a few key features. Gujarat was already one of the fastest growing states even before Modi came to power. This is very important to understand. When Gujarat is shown to the world as, this high growing state, that happened, through the 80s and 90s, even before Modi became the chief minister of Gujarat. So the key point there is, once Modi came to power, what happened? What happened was this. There was a shift away from medium-scale, small-scale enterprises and growth based on medium-scale, small-scale enterprises to very large-scale enterprises. So big capital took over once Modi came to power. And there are examples, I think all of you know this. Ambani Group got a favored status in Gujarat. Adani Group basically built up its entire empire during Modi's tenure as chief minister. SR Group, got major benefits during this period. I'm just giving 3 examples of, big businesses benefiting very significantly. So what you actually see in Gujarat is once this move happens, where capital-intensive industries, big business takes over, there's a very strong nexus between big business and the state. So Modi worked very closely with big business houses, and this is something that we can expect, right, in the next 5 years. It already started, this process happened already, over the last 5 years. Captains of industry have been very close to Modi, and particular, corporate houses have, been extremely close to Modi, including Ambani's and Adani Group. But that particular nexus is going to deepen. And I'll make one more observation about this in a different context. But this is one feature that was, extremely important about the Gujarat model that we are going to see deepen in the larger Indian case in the next 5 years. The other thing that happened, and this is also very important, the other, crucial thing that happened is, the small-scale, medium-scale enterprise kind of growth also created jobs. It was a labor-intensive model. It absorbed workers. It created employment. What happened after Modi came to power is Gujarat model became a jobless growth model. Right? People who got educated did not get jobs. And this particular phenomenon was visible. It became extremely visible when the Patidars, the Patels went on an agitation. And they were asking for jobs. They were also asking for reservations. What was that whole phenomenon about? Patidars are actually, a wealthy community, an upwardly mobile community, and it's a business community. Why are they suddenly, launching this major agitation? It's basically a result of the particular model that Modi launched in Gujarat. And this is already visible in the larger Indian case in the last 5 years. Because what you see in the last 5 years is, they suppress the report, right? I mean, the periodic labor force survey. I will also comment on that in more detail. But they suppress the report. The report has now been released. And unemployment rate, it's true. Many of us wrote about it before the election. It's at a 45-year high, right? So what happened in Gujarat, has already been transported to the Indian economy, and it's going to further deepen. Because, this sort of a business, and state nexus. There's a political scientist called Atul Kohli who teaches at Princeton, who makes a very interesting distinction between what he calls as business-friendly, economic approach, policy approach, and market-friendly, policy approach. So he argues that under Indira Gandhi in the 80s, when she gets re-elected, once she, totally flushes out her, alliances with the communist parties, with the left broadly, when she comes back to power in 1980, she basically adopts a business-friendly approach. What happened after 1991, market-oriented reforms is a market-friendly approach. There's a fundamental distinction between business-friendly approach. Business-friendly approach is one in which, businesses are specially favored, policies are formulated to favor particular business houses, whereas markets, are, a more, objective, quote-unquote, economic kind of institution. and you unleash markets and you see what happens as a result. But business-friendly approach is a much more directed, focused kind of an approach to favor businesses as opposed to workers or other classes in society. So one of the key observations people have made about the Gujarat model is that it was a business-friendly model, not a market-friendly model. And that is something that we'll also expect to see across the Indian economy. So that's the second anchor. I think we have the Gujarat model to look at. The effects of that model are now very well analyzed. One of the effects is, heightening inequalities. Gujarat went through a sharp rise in various kinds of inequalities, including regional inequalities, within the state of Gujarat. Moving on, the third anchor from which we can potentially draw, some ideas about the future of Indian economy is looking at, two countries to begin with. I'll go to other countries. But the two countries that I want to look at, and historically in the 30s and 40s, are Germany and Italy. And all of you probably know what happened in Germany and Italy during that period. In the 30s, Hitler came to power in Germany, and in the 20s, Mussolini came to power in Italy. And they started what is known as the Nazi model in Germany and fascist model in Italy. If you look at those regimes, there is a reason why I'm bringing this particular comparison. Hindutva, when it was formulated, took direct inspiration from Hitler and Mussolini. And this is not, I'm not trying to read Modi, in comparison with Hitler or Mussolini. When Savarkar, Hedgewar, when Golwalkar, when they first started thinking about this ideology of Hindutva, they took direct inspiration from, Hitler's Germany or, Mussolini's Italy. More Hitler's Germany than Mussolini's Italy. But if you look at those economies or those societies, one key observation needs to be made, which is, the economic factors that dominated Italy and Germany at that time were somewhat different from the kinds of economic factors that are operating in India today. At that time, both these economies were responding to a major economic event, which is the Great Depression. And, they were trying to come out of the, debilitating effects of the Great Depression in the 30s. And a lot of the policy that they made, was in response to the Great Depression. In fact, those economies did much better than other economies like US or UK because of, the state-directed investment, state interventions in the economies. However, while saying that, the economic processes are somewhat dissimilar, there are also similarities. One of the similarities, and this is relevant for India, is during that period, the state took upon itself one major objective, which is that, all these Western European economies like UK or France or, and, the offshoots like US and so forth, they were much more developed compared to Germany and Italy. And there was a desire to grow faster and, equal, the development, that was achieved in these other economies. So that, is a common factor. What is the, comparative, national space, or what is the comparative set of countries that we are thinking about at this point? We are not thinking about US and UK or, Western Europe today. We are thinking about China. Right? And there's a lot of China envy in our country. China has done superbly well. Therefore, and India ought to do as well as China, but we haven't done as well. Yeah. So the point of comparison with the fascist regime or the Nazi regime is the China envy factor. So in order to catch up with China, we can tolerate a lot of authoritarianism in the economy, in the larger society. Right? So we can put aside democracy, we can put aside all these feedback loops, and we can go on an efficiency mode or a growth mode and try to equal, China's, economic growth kind of success. And I think, that's a key comparison between the fascist Nazi states of that period. One interesting point there is, the state took upon itself the task of, I don't know how many of you are familiar, there's a whole class of economic problems called principal agent problems. There's a central player that's the principal. It sets the terrain in which agents function. So for instance, capitalist is a principal, worker is an agent. So you can think of multiple examples like that. At that time, a lot of historians and commentators have said that the state was the principal. It was setting the terrain, the Nazi state or the fascist state, and the capitalist class was the agent. And the stage was being prepared for the capitalist class to take over and become the principal, and the state would then become the agent. Of course, it's now debatable, where India is. Is the Indian capitalist class a principal or an agent? Is it already setting, the logic of policy? Is it determining policy that the state is making? Or, is the state actually setting the policy through which, the capitalist class is still emergent? So this is an interesting question. But, you can formulate that principal agent question in this nexus between the state and large businesses. So that is, a point of comparison. You also see some similar processes emerging in the US in the 80s, when neoliberal policies were pushed down the throat. Structural adjustment policies, neoliberal policies were pushed down the throat by authoritarian regimes under Ronald Reagan, and similarly in UK, Margaret Thatcher is well known for pushing through very authoritarian policies in the UK. So, and both these states, US and UK at that time, worked very closely with big business. This is not the case with a lot of authoritarian populist regimes that are winning power in the West today. They are not, necessarily working with big business. If you look at Donald Trump, for instance, big business hasn't backed Donald Trump. It didn't back him in 2016 when he came to power, and they're still sort of hedging their bets about whether to back him fully today, right? So there is a much more ambivalent kind of space between Donald Trump and big business. But in India, and this is where, the older Nazi or fascist regimes, make sense. There is a, strong nexus already between big business and the state. And, there is also a lot of tolerance for authoritarian kinds of policies, so that, we can catch up with China or, the East Asian countries broadly, Singapore, Hong Kong, in terms of per capita income and so forth. The next anchor that we can draw upon is what happened in the last 5 years. And I already mentioned the two signature policies. The two signature policies, demonetization and GST bill, they created a lot of economic hardship for people who inhabited the informal sector. 90% of our labor force is in the informal sector. Everybody, a lot of people know that. But the key, I'll make a slightly different point there. The different point is what these policies did is they sort of moved the economy away from a cash-dependent economy to a cashless economy. So who is going to benefit from such a move? It's basically the large capital or corporate sector that's going to benefit, because they are connected. And also professionals. People who are technically trained, people who can use the formal instruments, credit instruments or other such instruments. They are going to benefit from this. It's a small, slender minority. If you take the entire economy, it's a slender minority. So there's a shift from informal to formal. There is a shift of power. There's a shift of focus. There's a shift of, economic strength from informal to the formal. And that's what these two policies achieved. Apart from creating a lot of hardship, they moved the economy away from the informal and, made the formal sector, much more profitable through these policies. In the long run, they're going to reap a lot more benefits from these policies. So such policies that favor the formal sector, that shift the economy away from informal sector, these policies would also be taking root and, gaining strength, over the next few years. So the last anchor that I want to talk about is, the whole, global economy and where Indian economy is located in the larger global economy. And one of the things that some of you who may have followed, what is going on in the global economy in terms of trends, much of the global economy beyond Asia, if you look at US or Europe, some of these larger, wealthy spaces, what you actually see is, these spaces are not growing rapidly, and they're still reeling under the crisis that started in 2008, and they haven't solved that crisis. So post 2008, growth rates are much lower, investment levels are much lower, profits are high, but investments are not forthcoming, even though profitability has improved quite significantly. So what has happened in all these economies is, you have jobless growth, you have rising unemployment, and you see rising populism in the political domain, and also calls for economic nationalism, whether it's Trump's America or Brexit, or several of these economies are calling for economic nationalism. Economic nationalism being, protectionist policies, or, ways in which, the local economy is promoted at the expense of, let's say, other economies. So, there's a move away from globalization. Economists in the latest issue talked about a phenomenon called deglobalization, right? So this is something that is afoot there. But this is not the case in India, right? So we are still keen on continuing with our globalization. But at the same time, one of the things that, there are four, kinds of expenditures in any national economy that will create demand, that will create growth in an economy. One is, consumption, private consumption and government consumption. So these are two consumption-related things. The third one is investment, and the fourth is net exports and imports. So if you look at the global economy, since global economy is sluggish, it has slowed down. Indian growth cannot come from exports, export growth. So this cannot be an East Asia kind of model. So it's going to come from, and consumption, the large majority of people in India are not going to witness, major consumption gains in the near future. So that's not the, route through which growth is going to take off. So it has to be investment. It has to be private investment, and private investment both domestic as well as FDI. FDI is a small portion of the overall investment in the country, but domestic investment is a route it's going to take. So what it would basically mean is a lot of concessions to corporate players to induce investment from them, to create new sets of incentives in order to generate corporate investments. And these processes, who knows if they are going to succeed or not, but definitely they have huge effects. So if this is the future, these are the broad ideas that we can derive from various anchors that we have around, the Gujarat Model, or the fascist regimes of the 30s and 40s, or what Nirmala Sitharaman is indicating in her budget speech, or the state of the global economy. What are the kinds of effects that we are going to witness in the Indian economy over the next 5 years? So the first effect, I think, is rising instability, right? I mean, several of the policies that were made in the last 5 years, let me say it openly, were incompetent, right? Demonetization is not a competently thought out policy, right? It may benefit corporate players in the long run, but the way it was implemented, the way GST bill was implemented, there is a certain incompetence. If you look at Nirmala Sitharaman's budget, I don't know how many of you have read the commentaries on the budget. Today there was an article in the Wire that said, the revenue proceeds, according to economic survey, are very different from the revenue proceeds according to the budget. So this is a glaring discrepancy. Some heads will roll, definitely, because you cannot have a discrepancy between a document that comes the day before the budget is presented and the day the budget is... so in one day, there cannot be a significant difference in the volume of revenue, value of revenue proceeds. Similarly, Jayati Ghosh, an eminent economist from JNU, has pointed out that, it's not clear looking at the growth rates. Of course, growth rates themselves are contested right now, given the GDP calculations. People like Pranab Sen, Arvind Subramaniam, Nagaraj, R. Nagaraj from Indira Gandhi Institute, they've all pointed to various problems with the way GDP is calculated. Therefore, there's a cloud over, even the growth rates, even the reduced growth rates that we are witnessing in India today. But the point is that, with these growth rates, what Jayati Ghosh points out is there is no way, the revenues are going to equal the number that Nirmala Sitharaman presented. So there is what she says is, the entire budget exercise ought to be redone. That's what that's how she ends her article. You have to redo the entire exercise because this is fundamentally incompetent. So, incompetent policies are going to lead to instability. And demonetization was an incompetently conceived policy and it was implemented incompetently. And GST bill similarly was implemented incompetently. So what you actually may see is rising instability due to incompetence. I mean, that may actually work in favor of the progressive forces. This government so far hasn't displayed, extreme competence in the economic domain, right? So that is something that we may potentially use to our benefit. The second thing is, to the extent that, policies are competently made and implemented, what we are going to witness is a rise in inequalities of various kinds. And it's not just interpersonal inequalities. In fact, over the last 5 years, one of the ways in which, the government has been able to circumvent the entire feedback loop is by killing the public sphere, right? The entire public sphere, especially in the economic domain. People have talked about social media, WhatsApp, all that stuff. But if you look at the economic sphere, Planning Commission was killed. Right? Planning Commission was a crucial institution. When Planning Commission came out with the poverty line, and the poverty line was not in agreement with, what other economists thought, there would be a public debate, right? And this is crucial because without an agreed upon poverty line, how do you make allocations to different states? Right? How do you even think about budgetary allocations, based on something like poverty? So there is by replacing Planning Commission, which was a public kind of a body with Niti Aayog, which is like a think tank, and it's not accountable to anybody. It's only accountable to Modi. Right? Modi calls, he chairs the meetings, he calls the meetings, and they make policy decisions. They're not accountable to the people of India at this point in time. It's like a think tank. Planning Commission, on the other hand, had a long history of accountability. So that's, one example. Another thing that this government did right after it came back to power is it merged, the Central Statistical Organization with the National Sample Survey Organization. For those of you who do not know about these organizations, National Sample Survey Organization was set up in the 50s by a great statistician called P.C. Mahalanobis. And, it has generated all the data that we use to talk about inequality, poverty, the welfare measures, the success or failure of economic policy. And by integrating these two bodies and making it directly, it now reports directly to the Prime Minister, you have basically taken out the accountability of National Sample Survey Organization. Some of us have used a lot of that data, to make arguments about rising inequality in India. If you look at the last 5 years, the government didn't release any data, right? And once this sort of an integration happens, these bodies lose whatever credibility they have. These were proud organizations which valued their autonomy and generated data that that answered several of the deep controversial economic issues that were raised in the country. And now you basically those spaces have been killed. So but the effect of the policies that I have outlined would be rising inequalities. I hope there is a way of capturing that phenomenon. I hope there's a way of showing it, because in the current regime, current dispensation, there is no way of even analyzing the data and telling the public that inequality has risen. So you have to, maybe people have to come out with their own parallel surveys and generate their own numbers and use those numbers to come out with some of the criticisms of the government. So the first effect would be rising instability, partly due to incompetence, also partly due to the kinds of policies, macro policies that contribute to instability. The second thing would be rising inequalities, and this will take a particular form. Again, as I reiterated many times, 90% of our labor force is informal, and that entire labor force is going to become economically, in a relative sense, weaker compared to the formal labor force and the formal sector. So inequality is going to rise among the workers, but also between workers and the formal capitalists. Inequalities are going to increase regionally. So that's another effect, because some states have better infrastructure, some states can attract better investment climates. They can create better investment climates. Big capital will flock to certain states. This is going to heighten regional inequalities. There's also a huge problem in the country today. Already the labor force participation of women is very low, and it's also declining over whatever reported statistical periods that we are analyzing. And this is a major crisis, and feminist economists have argued that increased burden at home, increased reproductive burdens are central to how women's labor force participation is declining. And it's this is the case today. There was a nice there's a nice piece in the Hindu by K.P. Kannan and Ravindran. They show how the problem of unemployment is not just in the formal sector, but also in the informal sector now. And the problem of unemployment is going to affect women a lot more than men. So all these inequalities are going to rise. And if we go back to the Gujarat model, the other thing that people have pointed out is ecological contradictions. This growth-first strategy, growth-centric strategy has put away natural processes aside. Although Modi goes and signs the climate accord in Paris, comes back and says you look at Gujarat as a good example. Environmental clearances were not given to a lot of projects that were taken up. In fact, environment clearance was not needed for several of these corporate houses. So that's a particular process that's going to heighten. The other thing that, going back to Gujarat, what we can glean is there's also going to be a lot of pressure on land, land that belongs to smallholders, small farmers, land that belongs to the state is, going to be, accumulated in the hands of private players. What David Harvey and others have, Marx talked about something called primitive accumulation. David Harvey uses the expression accumulation by disposition. This is a particular process that deepened in Gujarat during Modi's regime, and that's a process that's also going to deepen with a much higher majority in Lok Sabha, and shortly they'll also take over Rajya Sabha majority. They are going to push through various reforms in land acquisition and so forth. So that's a particular contradiction that's going to deepen. So the effects are, it's not clear that, economic growth will heighten, but, some of the contradictions are going to, heighten quite intensely, especially instability, inequalities, and ecological contradictions, and pressure on, land displacement, land acquisition is going to accelerate. I mean, these are all processes that one can glean. Nobody knows for certain what the future has in store, but these are processes that are going to most likely come about. Now, the same. So, what is the to sort of conclude? What is the alternative to all this? Right? Do we have an answer to what is going on? Do we have a clear answer to why people, despite facing higher hardship, economic hardship, went and voted for the same regime? Do we have a clear answer for that question? Do we have a clear answer for what kind of an alternative model that we need to adopt and push for in our political movements and so forth? These are questions that need to be raised. So one of the I'll say two things about it. One is, the same contradictions that I'm talking about that are going to deepen will also give us opportunities. The fact that, the economic growth model is going to marginalize, 90% of the labor force means that, 90% of the labor force is waiting to be mobilized. Are we going to do that? How are we going to do it? How are we going to think through, how are the left parties or, the non-party, social movements going to address the question of, mobilizing and organizing the informal workers? That's a big question. This is something that especially the organized left has not been able to do so far. If you look at the communist parties, for instance, they'll show that, they have many more informal workers on the rolls. So, there are large trade union memberships now, but, they don't know what to do with those memberships, other than mobilizing them for a public meeting and so forth. So this is something that provides an opportunity. Every contradiction that I talked about, ecological contradictions are going to provide opportunities. There will be a lot of dissatisfaction. We have seen already. On the one hand, Bombay is flooding and Chennai is going through a severe, water scarcity. So this time, we have had a terrible monsoon, all the way from Kerala, Karnataka to, Hyderabad. So, you are actually going to witness, the deepening of contradictions, deepening of hardship. And each of these contradictions is going to provide an opportunity. Two other contradictions. One is on the political front, there'll be a huge contradiction between, a federalist kind of understanding of India and a narrow nationalist kind of imposition. And that's something, that could come out in the domain of language, it could come out in the domain of political autonomy, could come out in the domain of, economic policy autonomy, but, there will be a fight back along the federalist lines. And there's also an imposition of this, one nation, one economy, one nation, one polity, one nation, one culture kind of an imposition on the entire diversity. And that will create contradictions between, for instance, minorities in the country, Dalits and minorities in the country who will be further marginalized, through these policies. And, this very narrow notion of the nation, right, which is trying to colonize all these other identities. But the key point that I'll sort of end with is what we need. I think, this is something that when I was reading a lot of articles, about the elections and so forth, people kept talking about how, there was no credible alternative to Modi, right, in terms of the election. The problem with that formulation is, why are we thinking about the whole thing in terms of individuals? We are already entering Modi's terrain once we take that position. So it's, Modi and his followers have tried to convert the last election into a presidential form. And, so we should not enter that terrain and say, we'll follow the presidential form and look for a credible alternative to Modi. What we need, I think, is, the left politics has become a politics of fragments. It's a politics of a particular class. It's a politics of, Dalits. It's a politics of a region. It's a politics of women. It's a politics of Adivasis. I think, through all these fragments, we need to reimagine our understanding of an alternative nation. Right? If you want to counter this particular virulent nationalism, a narrow form of nationalism, we cannot give up the fragment, but can the fragment also have a notion of an alternative nation? And where will that idea come from? Right? Where will that alternative idea of nation come from? It can't be a top-down exercise. It cannot be an exercise where a few people, intellectuals can say, well, this is how we should think about the alternative. That's not how it's going to come out. It has to be an organic notion. On the other side, also it's an organic, notion of the nation that Modi and others are working with. It's a class project. What is the class project? It's the big capitalist classes. It's the professionals who came together, technically oriented professionals, and they're basically saying, there are all these fragments, the nation has become weaker. We want a strong nation. The capitalist class wants a strong nation. The professionals are willing to give up democracy, go through authoritarian rule in order to achieve economic improvements. So that's the kind of nation, and that nation is trying to colonize, various fragments. If you look at the Lokniti surveys from the recent election, it has also colonized, Dalits, for instance. There's a higher proportion of Dalits that voted for Modi in this election compared to last election. I was surprised, more than 20%, around 20% of Muslims voted for Modi. So these are very surprising phenomena. But this narrow nationalist project is colonizing, various other fragments. The answer to Modi is not, who is another credible leader. The answer to Modi is, what is our credible alternative to form of nationalism? Right? While not giving up social justice, social justice is important. A process of, defending the economic rights of people is important. Fighting violence, exclusion, discrimination, those kinds of processes, which are identity-based, those are important. But at the same time, you have to work through all these fragments and come out with a strong bottom-up notion of nationalism. And that cannot happen, through some top-down commentaries. That has to happen through various conversations that happen across, different social movements. They have to meet, they have to figure out, it's time to end the fights. There are a lot of fights that happen among, social movements. There are a lot of contradictions. But there are also, some issues on which, they can come together. So what is that, the alternative form of the national that they can work with and, provide an alternative to this class project, which also has the strong nation. The class project of high economic growth that will benefit a few with, a strong nation. So we need a nationalist project that will benefit, many more, let's stop using the word majority, that majority is with us. I think we play right into the hands of, BJP, because they use that term. If you say majority is with you, we say that Hindus are a majority, they are with us. So I think it's not the majority, it's all these different classes and castes and genders and, various groups that will have to come together and create an alternative form of, a nation which also believes in social justice. And that is the challenge in front of us. Thank you.
Hi, I have my own personal question. I've been following you very closely on the discourse that you've given. But how do you draw analogy between increasing inequality and also the reducing poverty as such? India has also done extremely well in terms of reducing poverty as well, and those figures are quite stunning to the other people. That's why they go gaga over some of these figures, and that's the major issue that I often come across, and it's difficult for me to dwell upon that.
So that's see, when you have an income distribution for the whole society, poverty looks at a particular portion of that distribution. So absolute poverty looks at the bottom portion of that distribution. You arbitrarily impose some kind of a poverty line. Arbitrarily meaning you could come out with some basis this many calories, are have to be consumed. So, this is the monetary value of, what people need to have in order to be above that poverty line. So that's the bottom portion of the distribution. Inequality is about the whole distribution. So you can very well have a widening distribution for the whole society, while the bottom portion of the distribution is doing better. Right? So let me put it differently. In other words, everybody's incomes may be rising, but the incomes of the poor may be rising slower compared to the rest of society. So but the incomes of poor are nevertheless rising, so you actually see a decline in poverty. But then, other people are witnessing much higher increases in their income. So this is not just India, this is the whole world almost. Especially, in Asia. If you look at China, it has the same phenomenon. Rapidly escalating inequalities and very impressive gains in poverty reduction. There is a serious reservation I have with the poverty story, which is it's not clear what the basis of the absolute poverty line that even the Planning Commission was using. There's a lot of criticism around that. So what is the right poverty line to use? This is not something that, so when do you say somebody is poor or somebody is not? So do you base it on some monetary value? So what if, my income is rising, but at the same time, I'm also witnessing huge increase in education of my children and healthcare of my family. Or, it could be other, even purchasing power may rise, but the point is, there are certain items of expenditure like healthcare and education that have seen, an astronomical increase in costs. So you may see rising incomes, but you may also see rising expenditures on certain counts. So, so that is, it's not clear. So one of the major criticisms of Indian poverty numbers is that, it's not based on something like capabilities. Is my right to, healthy food being satisfied? Is my right to an acceptable shelter being satisfied? Is my right to acceptable clothing being satisfied? Am I, earning enough to, to educate my family, my children well? These are all capabilities. You can actually view poverty as a way of verifying whether, people are improving their capabilities. And the criticism about Indian poverty line is that, people's capabilities may be worsening, but poverty is actually declining. So a lot of people are not using those arbitrary poverty lines. For instance, the last paper that I wrote on poverty dates back to 2011. After that, I stopped writing about poverty because it's not clear, from the numbers that are available, how I can make a coherent, careful analysis of India's poor. And this point has been made eloquently well by economists like Utsa Patnaik, who has looked at something like food security. So people's poverty levels are declining, but their calorific intake is also declining. How do you make sense of that? So as your poverty levels go down, as you become less poor or, you come out of poverty, you should be eating better. You should be eating higher, the food calorific intake value ought to be higher. But calorific intake value has been declining in India over the last 30 years. So people like Utsa Patnaik are bitter critics of, the poverty lines that Indian government has used over the last 20 years. But this is not just Modi. This is also UPA. Yeah.
The instability and inequalities which is going to rise. So do you think the present government is aware that they're going to rise? Was EWS a result of that? Is my question even right, saying that maybe inequality is going to manifest itself with EWS? Is there a relation between that? Or is that just a pure... Is it going to, the way it's going to manifest, is EWS going to maybe solve that, that quota for that? Yeah. And that, or was it just an election gimmick, or is there a relation how it's going to work? Or do you think that government knew that it's going to eventually happen?
So, economic reservations, for based on caste or religion or gender, these are not meant to address the question of poverty, right? These are not meant to address the question of economic hardship for the those particular caste groups or religious groups or women who benefit from that. They were conceived as policies that would help these groups share, the state power. Right? That is what reservations were created for. They're not going to take, and then the hope is that, they will also create upward mobility, right, within these communities. These people who benefit from reservation will go back and work for their own community. But they were not devised on an economic basis. They were, it's more of a power basis, sharing of power among different communities. So, when you introduce something like economic reservations, what you are basically saying is, I'm going to address economic inequalities through reservations, right? And that, is not something that the state can do. It doesn't have the capacity. Is it going to introduce economic, reservations, reservations based on economic status in the private sector? That's the sector that is expanding. That's the sector that is going to absorb, that absorbs a significant chunk of the labor force in India. Do you have reservations in the private sector? So how are you going to address the question of poverty? So it's a symbolic gesture. It's another gesture that highlights the logic of the nation. Right? We are against these fragments. We are against the fragment of caste. We are against the fragment of religion, and other kinds of reservations that exist. We believe in one nation, and in that nation, the only, so we ignore all these different fragments and then provide some reservations, on a populist basis, regardless of what the identity of the person is. So it's assertion of one identity, which is a narrow national identity over other identities. It's not really going to address the economic problems of people who will benefit. It may address individual problems, but it's not going to make much of a difference at a societal level.
You talked about the cashless economy thing, in the whole cashless thing in the budget. So when you said only the 10% of the formal sector would be like at an advantageous position compared to the 90% of informal. So maybe the another way of looking at it is like getting the whole cashless thing is to get the 90% of the informal sector into the formal sector. And I think in this budget, we have got them into the pension scheme. So is it a better move, like, instead of like criticizing it?
That's a good question. So let me start with the second part of what you asked. Who got the pensions? It's the small shopkeepers and traders. Why do you think the budget incorporated that? We can't say it with certainty, but it's clearly an RSS complaint against Modi. The foundation of RSS has been shopkeepers and traders for the longest time. Right? And one of the things that happened during the previous 5 years is shopkeepers and traders who have been most loyal to Jansangh or RSS all these decades have been severely attacked through these economic policies that Modi launched. So no wonder in the very first budget, Modi announces pension schemes. It's RSS demand. Basically, that's how those pensions got devised. The first part of the question, that's a very important question. Is it even possible for the Indian economy or any economy, right, which is growing so late, right? These are all late developing countries. If you go to China, for instance, about 60% of Chinese labor force is informal. Even after all that growth, growth in the formal sector, growth in the overall economy, 60 to 70% of the labor force is still informal, right? The estimates vary. In India, about 90% of the labor force is informal. How do you incorporate all these people into the formal sector? The only way you can expand the formal sector is by introducing labor-intensive, manufacturing models. That's what worked in East Asia to some extent. That's what worked in late developing nations like China, for instance. But if you look at even countries in Western Europe, right, which have the classic capitalist models, they also faced joblessness. In the 19th century, England had huge, growth in the informal sector. If you read Marx's Capital, there are very rich descriptions of how a large part of the workforce in London, in Manchester, Birmingham, some of the prominent cities in England, some of these cities had huge, informal working class. But what happened, to the informal workers in England? They were not incorporated into the formal sector. They were basically sent off to other countries. They had all these colonies, right? America was, with the so-called expanding frontier, was available for England, right? They sent off a huge part of their workforce to England, to US or to Australia, to New Zealand, right? All these places actually were available for England to send their surplus labor. Where can China and India send their surplus workforce? There has never been the only story so far, that is somewhat convincing about the incorporation of informal workers into formal sector is the old East Asian model. Japan after World War II, South Korea after 1960, and Singapore and Hong Kong, 1960s, 70s, the East Asian tigers, and to some extent the Southeast Asian cubs, as they're called. But even there, after the initial incorporation, a lot of these workers have become part of the informal workforce today. Right, starting in the 80s, once neoliberal policies started entering that space, a lot of formal sector workers were kicked out of the formal sector. So this is, the nature of technology, the nature of growth, the kind of sectoral growth that is introduced makes it impossible for, a workforce of our proportions, of our dimensions to be, formalized.
You were talking about the left parties or the trade unions or maybe the civil society mobilizing the informal sector. So what exactly they can do, when you say that it is not practically possible to get them into formal, what can the left do?
Yeah, understood. See, one of the things about the informal sector is, the labor that is performed in the informal sector is severely undervalued. Take a very simple example. A lot of people who are sitting here probably have housemaids, right? Women who come and work in the house as house help, right? Domestic help. Think about their salaries, how many hours they are working. Compare that to, the employer's salaries, the number of hours that the employer works and the salary that they get. Compare that to the number of hours this woman works in your house and the salary she gets. It's, the labor of informal workers is severely, undervalued. And therefore, the big challenge, one of the big challenges about informal work is, how do you revalue their labor? And how do you, provide them better compensation? How do you create, a space where the exchange between the formal sector and the informal sector, becomes more equal. Right now, there's a very severe unequal exchange between the informal sector and informal sector. Formal sector feeds off, and formal sector is subsidized by the informal sector. What is that poor woman who is working in your house doing? She's subsidizing your labor, right? Otherwise you have to perform that labor yourself. So she's subsidizing, your household so that you can go and make much higher amounts. So that has to be revalued. So that's just an example. But the broader story is one of unequal exchange. between the formal and informal sectors. And the subsidy that the informal sector, the poor, are giving the rich, that has to be reversed. That's the big fight. And how do you mobilize these workers? So for instance, farmers are part of the informal sector. How do they get better value for their produce? The same farmers don't get, remunerative, revenues from agriculture alone. Right? So from all the way from Orissa, if you go around the city in summertime, there are a lot of brick kiln workers who come from Orissa and lay out brick kilns around Hyderabad. So what are they doing? They are providing very cheap, services to you. And that's going to be reality. That is the reality of the future Indian economy. You will have a large informal sector. But that doesn't mean, there is no way out of, the rising inequalities. You have to empower the informal workers. You have to make sure that, informal workers get paid much better for the kind of labor they are performing. Those are the kinds of fights that we need to go through.
Sir, my question is regarding the fiscal deficit policies that the government has been following. That since the neoliberal period, we've been seeing a fiscal deficit of maybe 2-3% or not really more than that. So where does this fit in with the logic that everything, if the government increases its expenditure, it's necessarily going to be inefficient, this sort of neoliberal ideology? How has it managed to be so persistent? And can we really say that everything that the government does is inefficient? Because if you look at the post-World War period, a lot of these major inventions, such as the mobile phone and all these other important innovations, it was government-led programs which drove innovation. But now we don't see that logic anywhere as such. So what can we do to get a new perspective about these things?
That's a long sort of question, but let me say 2-3 things. You're absolutely right that post World War II, states played a very crucial role, but it's not just post World War II. If you read this Korean economist called Ha-Joon Chang, who teaches at Cambridge, he is in the Faculty of Economics at Cambridge. What he shows is that throughout the history of capitalism, state has played a key role in promoting industrial activity. It has, provided the liability, for various corporations to innovate, to enter into new ventures and so forth. But what happens after 1940s is a combination of, a Keynesian macro policy, where, as you rightly pointed out, there were clear trade-offs. If you had high unemployment, you increase the budget deficit, you increase demand in the economy, and unemployment would go down. But then, it would become inflationary, right? So then, you try to control inflation by reducing the budget deficit. So it became there was a trade-off. At least people thought there was a trade-off. Starting in the late 60s, early 70s, what you saw was a breakdown of that simple trade-off. Trade-off was not dead, but the simple trade-off died for a brief period, through the late 60s to mid 70s or late 70s. And then, the trade-off came back. Paul Krugman makes this point eloquently, but during that period when the trade-off broke down, and that broke down because, the economy, the developed country economies became hyperinflationary. There were multiple reasons for that. Profitability was going down in these economies. Then, you also had this whole oil price induced inflation. OPEC countries were jacking up prices. Wages were continuously rising for working classes. So, that also created a cost push kind of inflation. So in the early 70s, you actually had very high inflationary pressures. During that period, one of the key things that happened is, a particular constituent of the capitalist class became extremely powerful. So, and that is what people call as the financial capitalist class. And financial capitalist class, basically, they began to control national economic policies roughly from around that time, because until then you had stable exchange rates, bilateral exchange rates, fixed exchange rates. Once exchange rate was floated and it became flexible, financial capitalist class went to the powers, global powers, and said, you have to give us freedom of mobility. Otherwise, if one currency tanks, then we are going to die with that currency. So we need a lot more mobility, right, in the across the globe. And one of the things financial capitalists hate is inflation. They became extremely powerful during that period, but one of the things they hate is inflation. Why do they hate inflation? It's a simple logic. When you look at interest rate, there is a nominal interest rate. When you go to the bank and borrow money, you are given money at 8%, let's say, or 9%, whatever the interest rate is. That is the nominal rate. What is the real interest rate? Real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation. That's the real return for the financial capitalist class. So as the inflation rate rises, you won't change the nominal interest rate, right? I mean, that is a defined contract. When you get a loan, it's already defined. But in the meantime, if inflation rises, then your real rates are going to decline. So it's always in the interests of the financial capitalist to keep the inflation rate down. So as the financial capital or capitalist class, the constituent of the overall capitalist class, became powerful and dominant, they imposed various structures on national economies through which inflation rates would be low. So one of the ways in which they did that was by controlling fiscal deficits. Because a rising fiscal deficit would mean rising inflation. It could mean rising inflation. So keep a cap on budget deficits, and they succeeded in doing that. And even during times, so post 1980, Paul Krugman shows eloquently. He argues eloquently. In fact, he came to Amherst, last year, and he made this point. Starting in the 80s, you actually see the trade-off returning, right, between inflation and unemployment. But people are stuck in the 70s mode. And why are they stuck in the 70s mode? Because financial capital became so dominant that, they would control IMF, they would control World Bank, right, the stabilization policies of International Monetary Fund, or the structural adjustment policies of the World Bank. They are premised on, one of the key features that they talk about is inflation. You have to control inflation. Therefore, you have to control fiscal deficit. And the only period during which this particular thing was relaxed was right after the global crisis of 2008. So there was a window of 3 years, 2008 to 2011, when some of these multilateral agencies looked away and said, what you are committing is blasphemy. This is against economic orthodoxy. But we look away because we need, somehow these economies have to survive. So that was the only period. Right after 2011, you saw a return of austerity. I mean, one of the prime examples of that is the Greek collapse. Right? So anyway, that is the broader answer. So there are strong forces that would prevent, fiscal deficits from going up, even though they may be beneficial in the short run to economies. But I'll end with, the answer to your question with a nugget. Today, I forget who wrote it. She wrote it in The Wire, one economist. This whole incompetence of Nirmala Sitharaman's budget, the difference in revenue proceeds between economic survey and the budget, what it indicates is, if economic survey numbers are right, then the fiscal deficit would go up to 4.3% this year. So, sometimes incompetence helps the economy. So, it could lead to a higher deficit, if, some of those expenditures go in the direction of promoting consumption.
So, informal sector by definition is a non-tax-paying sector. So, wouldn't it be better for the country on the whole that these guys, small and micro businesses, start paying their taxes properly? Like, for example, we all know Ram Bande. He had a daily cash box of around 1 lakh rupees. I'm definitely sure he never paid 1 rupee of tax. But today, he has a shop right in Banjara Hills, in the heart of the city, which he might have ended up buying with the money which he didn't pay for taxes. So wouldn't it be better if small and micro businesses start paying taxes?
I have no problem with, informal sector businesses paying taxes. As long as they don't pay taxes that will kill their businesses, there's nothing wrong in expecting the informal sector to pay taxes. But a large part of the informal sector is also the farm economy. Right? All the farmers are part of the informal sector. No, they don't pay taxes. But if you think of it as a historical process, if you look at Indian society or most societies, before 19th century, the only people who paid taxes were farmers, right? Land revenue was the base, the foundation on which, entire societies were built. So, it's okay, let's say a historical wrong is being corrected by, allowing farmers a little bit of extra revenue. But that's not really helping them. Right? There's a huge amount of agrarian distress. But your question is confined to medium and small scale enterprises. I see nothing wrong in, if it's possible to incorporate them in the tax base, there's nothing wrong in actually, making them pay taxes. We have a very small tax base, both individual direct taxes as well as, corporate taxes. So we rely a lot on indirect taxes. And indirect taxes are regressive. By definition, indirect taxes are regressive. They put a higher burden on the poor. So if we can improve our direct taxation system, GST is supposed to do that. Let's see what GST will do in the end. But GST is supposed to do exactly that. So we'll see, some of those analyses will come out in the coming years.
I'd like to have your comments on allocation of this budget on education, on health, and also on the agrarian sector, So, and what are the repercussions and defense? I'm a little unclear about the defense. And how is it going to play out? I mean, what are going to be the repercussions of the allocations in the near future in terms, according to these parameters?
So I didn't look at the proportions, actual proportions of allocations, because they're all in the annexures. I read the budget speech carefully, but one has to go to the annexures. But there are pieces by Jayati Ghosh. There's a piece today in the Wire by Sudha Narayanan, again at the Indira Gandhi Institute. What they argue is that allocations to the agrarian sector are abysmal this year. Although one of the key economic issues that was pushing BJP towards Pulwama, Balakot kind of a discourse was agrarian distress, and there were lots of farmer movements, protests last year. This budget doesn't answer the demands of farmers. The allocations are abysmally low, and even health and education, allocations are much lower than what they ought to be. This is the commentary I read. So, on the other hand, of course, defense, and that's an area that this government would obviously, it feels that it has won the mandate through the whole discourse of national security, and it's ramping up its expenditures on defense, and that also has various insidious connections. There's also new collaborations with Israel, for instance, with US. US also has put India as one of the most favored nations. So what it basically means is, again, there may be some of these expenditures may lead to a slight increase in economic growth, but that's not going to benefit the people. That's the major repercussion. Because, farmers are going to be left out by the current allocation, and healthcare and education, which are rising costs in a majority of Indian budgets, those costs are going to further escalate, and that's going to worsen, both the absolute living conditions, but also, relative inequalities. But the defense expenditure, it's like, what Reagan did to pull America out of the recession of the 70s. He engaged in what is known as defense Keynesianism. So the state was spending a lot of money on defense, so that allowed the growth rate to pick up, the economy to revive. But at the same time, it didn't really benefit the people, American people of that period. It will be a very similar outcome.
Thank you for your time. I just have two questions. One is about an overall understanding. Are you understanding my? Yeah. Overall understanding about the relation about nationalism and economic growth. As economics student, I want to understand a little bit about this. For example, in Asia, you see India and China. China, they are doing something little bit surprising about, I think last year, as their president was, as he said, we will lift out poverty for nearly 300 million people in 1 year. On the other hand, in north of the country, what is going on is about putting some people in the camps for just to make them leave about the culture and to come in the country and take part of the economic growth and to be mentally to be ready for the economic growth of the China. And on the other hand, in India, as you see, especially for the Modi government, how they little bit interacting with the minority people and pushing them down in some areas. How that influence the economic growth in China, what they want to do in the economy, they are doing everything they can. And India, they are a little bit back still. How long it can take for India to grow very smoothly without not putting some people down. And the other thing is about the target for India. Like where it's the target. For example, in China, their target is about they are very much interacting with African countries to build a lot of infrastructure, to bring a lot of their products. In India, are they willing to go for the poorer countries who are coming out right now, who are getting some good economics, who want to buy a lot of things? And last, I think in 2013 or 14, they did something good about India and Africa summit about that. How that is right now? How is that working? I want to get some about those two questions.
That would require several lectures, but I teach, I'm also writing a book on India and China. Maybe I'll send you the PDF. But just one, two broad responses. One is China's growth story starts in 1978. It roughly corresponds with India's growth story, which also takes off around 1980. But China's growth story is much more spectacular. There are two reasons for that. One is, multiple reasons, but let me highlight two reasons. One is, the global economy, the rest of the world, especially the developed capitalist world, begins to see China as a site where manufacturing can be done. So what happens in China is not only what the Chinese do, but also how the rest of the globe, how it deals with China, right? So US, UK, but also mainly to begin with in the 80s, it was, non-resident Chinese who were in Hong Kong or Macau or Singapore. They sent their investments, and then, it starts picking up. And by the 90s, you see a lot of investment coming from the rest of the world, and China begins to grow. That's one side of the story. The second side of the story is during Mao's period, right, when China was still communist, right? This is between 1949 and 1976. There were several policy blunders, but 2-3 very crucial and important things were done by Mao. One of the key features, and India and China were very comparable in the late 40s, right? But China surged ahead on 2-3 counts. One is, primary education, school education. China educated almost everybody among its young people. And we put a lot of energy into higher education. So we have produced, much before China, we produced world-class intellectuals, whereas they produced an educated working class. right? So that made a huge difference once China opened its economy to the global economy. And the second thing is, during Mao's period, they also built a lot of infrastructure, both in rural spaces but also in cities. And the Indian state never succeeded. Indian state also created infrastructure, but not on the same scale, especially in rural areas, but even urban spaces, China was ahead by late 70s. And these two factors came together. The global economy was looking for a fix. It needed a place where it could find workers, well-trained workers, who could be paid low wages. And China created that kind of workforce during Mao's period. And then, of course, there are a lot of interpretations that China is extremely nationalist. And the fact that, it didn't face democratic constraints doesn't mean that, so there's nationalism, there's no democracy. But at the same time, a combination of these two doesn't mean that, there is no need for legitimacy of the state. The legitimacy of the Chinese state was achieved through economic improvement. When that started slowing down, they had trouble. Xi Jinping is facing that today, the Chinese president. In the Indian case, that kind of a confluence of factors never emerged. We never educated, from the domestic side, we never educated, even as recently as 2000, 2004, the literacy rate in India was something like 45%, 50%. Literacy rate, I'm not talking about, high-skilled man, human resources. So that's one thing that never happened. India never built its infrastructure. India never, also, one of the key things that Mao did is he equalized, right? He took over land. There was no private property in rural areas. There was only, villages owned the entire land. And there was no private property in urban areas. The state owned the entire land and, enterprises in the urban spaces. Whereas, we allowed our inequalities to fester and grow, and grow deeper through the first 30 years, which are progressive, Nehru, Indira Gandhi, that period, 50 to 80. Still, we never reduced our poverty, right? All that we did was we empowered a middle class, we educated them, and typically they belong to, upper caste or middle caste, and their children are the new middle class who don't care about democracy, who don't care about, the deeper, tolerance or, secularism. They want a faster growth. That's how, they know how to lead their lives. And that's one of the big constituents of Indian nationalism. So the kind of virulent nationalism that we have seen emerge in India is also a demand from, the beneficiaries. The beneficiaries of both the first 30 years, children of those beneficiaries, but also post-1980s, people who benefited, these are the people who are asking for the strong nation, right? And we have a democracy, and this is the key point. We have elections, and elections are seen as democracy, but you can win an election and also subvert or kill democracy. So that is the crisis we are facing right now. All the feedback loops that have been prevented, as I talked about, that is, a deep death of democracy, right? But electorally, we still have a democracy, but, the feedback, nominally, electorally, and once somebody wins an election, there's no question of, what is the mandate this particular party won or this coalition won? What is the particular mandate? Basically, they have untrammeled power. They can do whatever they want. So once they have power, they think they can restructure the country. So it's basically subversion of democracy and, emergence of a virulent nationalism. Whereas in the Chinese case, they never had democracy. And that's a problem. A lot of young people in China, they're very, very unhappy. In fact, over the last 1 year, a lot of students like yourself, who believe in Marxism, they've gone to places like Shenzhen, cities like Shenzhen, organizing migrant workers, and they've been put behind bars. They've been, their freedoms have been severely curtailed. So that is a problem. That's an issue China has to deal with. And that's a problem that's going to push them back at some stage in their future, trajectory. But what is happening in our case is we want to become like China, but we also want to retain a nominal electoral kind of democracy while killing all the deeper democratic institutions. And still, the confluence of factors that created that spectacular growth in China will not happen here. It's a pipe dream. I'm not saying that there will not be any growth, but what China witnessed is double-digit growth rates for 3 decades. That's unprecedented in human history. That's not going to happen again.
The entire process of incompetence and the budget is a sham that has been put on this country, so that the so-called intellectuals, as well as the non-intellectuals which make up the middle class, which have been basically the sufferers of a very poor primary education system that has been foisted on them, will keep themselves busy in the IPLs as well as the rest of the stories, while these guys will destroy all the democratic institutions which are there to control and make sure that there is the right numbers being presented as well as the right budgets being done. And that is being reflected by incompetence of the sort of leaders that they're putting in charge of the various departments. Nirmala Sitharaman is a defense minister. We know what a tragedy she was. Being an economist, maybe we had a little bit more hope with her to be the finance minister. But then this 1.5 lakh crores of a difference in income, which is being projected immediately after the economic survey in this budget, whereas keeping the expenses at the same level and then claiming a 3.3% deficit is obviously a sham, because at 1.5 lakh crore income that they're supposed to have got, if it is not coming in and it has to get funded in the sort of expenses that they are outlining, which also is a big question mark, because what they're going to do is they're not going to allocate it to the various departments. They will arbitrarily change it again. That is again incompetence of the system, because they have made sure that the people who are running the various systems, the bureaucrats that they have, that's the famous Gujarat model of compliance and basically incompetent officials being in charge of various departments, is also being seen here. So the whole story is now going to be that we are going to be living in lies. We will have nobody to question them, and they will essentially get their end results of the so-called labeled democracy of a farce nation, of an illiterate nation, in their control for the next number of years, because they have also destroyed the ability to change these people. Now, this is the larger and the deeper meaning that's coming out of this current election, the results of the current election, and the budget that has been put in front of us to divert the attention, even as the remaining things continue to happen. So in this scenario, what space do I see for all this 90% of so-called informal sector, out of which 20% or 30% of the people are going to maybe make it into the formal sector, but what about the rest? Are they all supposed to be are they all supposed to die as vermin? Or are they supposed to get into social strife with each other? Or is there going to be another war that will ensure that that entire liability of the state is taken away? What is it? What's the future that you're seeing in this?
Let me be brief. I mean, I broadly agree with what you said. Just as a brief response, let me come out with a rhetorical response, because, again, it will be a long response otherwise. People cannot eat nationalism. Right? People may experience nationalism, they may want a strong identity, but they cannot eat it, they cannot wear it, they cannot live in it. So, while I'm not an economic determinist, economic factors ultimately matter. If the government continues to be incompetent, so the danger is if they're really competent, right? Then, the challenge on, for the left or, for the opposition is going to be that much more difficult. So my own sense is that, if there is, an alternative, national, popular, a progressive alternative to the kind of nationalism they're offering, I think people will respond. There cannot be an empty materiality on which, the floating empty materiality of the economy cannot be the basis on which they can continue for a long time.
So I comically tell my friends that the most important news comes in 5th page, 6th page, in a very small article, and the most useless ones come in 1st page, 2nd page with big headlines. So I have to use microscope to read this most important news, and I found this 2 days ago. Indian Air Force lost 44 aircrafts since 2014 to till date. This is the answer given by the Defense Minister in Parliament in the recent session. And 26 fighter jets crashed, 6 helicopters crashed, 9 trainer aircrafts crashed, 3 transport airplanes crashed, and human casualty. 12 pilots died, 7 aircrew died, 27 service personnel died. This should have become a national debate. But, small news item. And this is peacetime. We are not even in war. And imagine how many will collapse when we go for war. And secondly, this is related to the economy. So we know the defense budget, how much we are allocating is, I think, roughly 35 to 40% of the budget, I guess. I don't know exactly, but so right now, imagine there is a war, which a lot of middle class crave to go for a war with Pakistan or China. So of the imports, the highest import is crude oil. And when we go for a war, the crude oil imports have to be doubled because the defense requires a lot of oil. So already we have extreme unmanageable current account deficit because our exports are less, imports are more. And when we go for a war and import double the crude oil, imagine how much current account deficit will be, whether we will be able to, right now we are borrowing, short-term borrowing and with the high interest rates to finance this current account deficit. And when this current account deficit doubles, how much do we have to borrow? Right now, India's both private and public debt is 125% of GDP, which means 300 lakh crores. So, added to that fiscal deficit. So, as an economist, can you just give us a better picture about this scenario?
So, current account deficits are not necessarily bad. The kind of current account deficit that you constructed is bad because, if it is funded by short-term borrowings. But in general, current account deficits are good for developing countries because, you can actually invest more than, what the domestic savings allow you to do. So in that sense, we have to be careful. There's nothing. Also, a debt of 125% is not that high. So that, those are, technical economic issues. But the first point you made.
So, and this creating a problem around our economic also, sir. So what I believe in Narendra Modi ji, he said very good dialogue, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. So I don't know how long this dialogue will sustain. Or Bharosa bhi also. If it is Bharosa, I don't think that we are going to tell.
So let me let me address because
No, this you can add on this. So our fiscal, FDI, which also helps in this reducing the current account deficit. 60% of the FDI is Indian money going abroad and coming in the round tripping. That is black money actually. So we have to consider these details too.
Yeah, in general, if the current account deficit is going up because of non-developmental processes like defense or other unproductive activities, that's not a good thing for any developing country. right? That's the broad point you're making. I agree with you. A debt of 100%, 125% is nothing. Most countries, US has a higher national debt. Japan has a national debt of 225% or something. So the technical questions, are not the key point. I think what the point you're making is, it's the unproductive kinds of processes that could lead to some of these deficits, increase in debt. And that's a cause for concern. I agree with you. The first point is a more significant point that you're making. Why do we have, these meaningless news on the front page, or largely meaningless news? And why do we have more important news on the 6th page? Whether it's about fighter jets or... There, I think, there are 2 points that are crucial. So one of the points that, this is not the case only during Modi period. This is also true for the last 30 years. The key policies, about the economy, key liberalization measures, they are introduced not in the budget typically, but by stealth, through government orders or through, in the monsoon session, when the focus on parliament policies is not very significant, when the media is, when the media is keenly following Balakot strikes, the government may introduce, by stealth, an economic policy. That's what we need to be vigilant about. I think, a lot of very significant, crucial policies, come through in unexpected ways, in stealthy ways. And that is, I think, an important point, right? So there's a way in which, the key policies are shrouded and not made visible to the public, so that, there could be a democratic discussion. So, in other words, even in, electoral democracies like India, a lot of what goes in the name of economy tries to escape democratic scrutiny. I think that's the point you are trying to make by saying that, 6th page, 7th page, key points are discussed there. And I think that's a very important point. Key issues, are kept out of democratic scrutiny. There's no accountability. Whereas, other issues, take center stage. And the media also plays a key role on what gets presented, what doesn't get presented. People like Noam Chomsky have talked about it in the context of America. Manufacturing consent. How do you, it's not, forcing the people, but it's by controlling the kinds of information that you feed people with. You don't give them the entire information. You only give them part of the story. You don't talk about how US supports apartheid regime when it existed in South Africa. But, you talk about, what happens in the House of Representatives or Senate. That becomes the front page news or center page news. So there are ways in which, important key issues are kept out of public debate. I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
So actually, one very small question, which I'm just opening up because I feel we need to find a way to talk about it in the Indian context, right? And the second is the question around the national popular, with which you ended. So the first question is, once you spoke about the hegemony of the finance sector, the finance capitalist sector, within the broad bourgeoisie, I'm going to connect it to caste in the sense of the particular set of castes that have historically been part of, trade, in the sense of, leveraging, right? Buying a commodity, part of commodity markets, leveraging commodity markets, leveraging money markets, etc., etc., etc. That is, at this point in India, if you think about, those are the castes that have kind of converged into both being the kind of the manufacturing sector as well as kind of the finance sector. So is there a particular kind of, is there a slightly different logic to the hegemony of finance capital in India? So that's the first question. Right? So, and the second is around the national popular. Let's say, if we were to think about, so to construct this national popular, to create the discussion on the ground, to think about a framework of economic nationalism as the national popular, right? So, because that's the real life of people. For the national popular in that sense, to create that discussion from the ground up. We can talk broadly about things like the, social movements, etc. But if we think about a collaboration between the social movements and the party left, and even the centrist parties, right? What is the one or two kinds of programs that we need to create within a party formation to be able to create this discussion that could lead us to experiment with certain notions of the national popular?
Let me ask you for clarification. What do you mean by programs?
I don't know. I mean, I use the word precisely because I don't know. I mean, I'm just saying, let's say, part of what all of us struggle with is that the left parties seem like a little bit of dead wood. We don't want them to die, but at the same time, they seem like a little bit of dead wood. So, if we were if there was a central committee or if there was a Politburo, what is the kind of decision you'd like to see coming from there to energize their base? The union folks that are kind of, they don't know where to go, right?
So let me start with the first question. The origins of the trading community and the financial community, historically, the kinds of communities from which that capital has arisen, some of it has fed into modern financial sector, but a large part of the modern financial sector is also filled with now professionals and multinational financial corporations. So it's a combination of those two, and in my own reading, apart from the deep connections that some of these communities have, with their own larger caste groups or, the state, as they evolved. Apart from that, they have modernized themselves quite significantly, is my sense. But there is a crony kind of, aspect to the trading and financial classes, I think, in this country, especially those that came from those historical origins, right? So I think that may be the distinctive nature. But then, one could ask the question, do financial capitalist classes, have a similar relationship with the state elsewhere in the world? And I have a feeling, in different ways. I mean, each case would be different. But I think there are aspects of cronyism, elsewhere too. On the second question, Biju, this is the tough question. Ultimately, what are the programs that, if I were sitting in CPM Politburo, for instance, I would ask, some fundamental questions about the failures of the party on several counts. So one of the failures is, why, when they had power for 30 years, why didn't they create cooperatives in Bengal, for instance? Worker cooperatives, they had that kind of autonomy, they had that kind of power. And similarly in informal working spaces, can they not create cooperative structures? I mean, they did brilliant work on tenancy legislation in the 80s. They also provided various support structures to agricultural, producers, through the 80s and 90s, definitely. But then, where are the cooperative structures? Where are the credit cooperatives? Where are the producer cooperatives? Where are the worker cooperatives in urban spaces? Those are deep failures. And I think, those are the kinds of programs that would become part of what you're calling as economic nationalism. We should just be careful with that term, because Trump believes that he is an economic nationalist. And people are, the connotation that people get from that expression is that, it's a protectionist kind of economy, which is supposed to favor, a particular, privileged group in society. That's the way it's being interpreted. But I think what you mean is a more egalitarian kind of order.
Yeah, I'm using the term economic nationalism in its broadest, but I'm saying one of the ways to interpret what you said about Nirmala Sitharaman's budget is that they are in NDA 3, Modi 2, trying to create a different version of an economic nationalism of their own, different from the Swadeshi.
Right.
So,
So what they are claiming today is, in fact, Nirmala Sitharaman says that openly. She says it's make in India. For pre-independence people, it's Swadeshi. Now it is make in India, which was a resounding failure. So if there is any program that is the most dismal failure, it is make in India. And I think, she's continuing to talk about that. But I think on the left, we need to have those conversations, Whatever.
You started off by talking about the impressive mandate that this government got and the reasons for it. But I think there's a lot of reservations on the ground and feedback that we're getting from various quarters that a lot of it was electoral manipulation. So we're not really sure, and all the analysis that we are therefore deriving from that mandate could be actually skewed because we don't know how much economy actually mattered. We don't really know how people voted. So this is, a very puzzling for most of us.
So my own sense is, even if that is true, that there was a lot of electoral manipulation, and if they can do it, they'll do it. These are the kinds of leaders who will do that. The reason to be skeptical that there was deep electoral manipulation is there are 2-3 indicators that suggest otherwise. One is the exit polls, and exit polls across the board suggested a higher majority, or at least a maintenance of BJP's previous performance. And there were 2-3 exit polls like India Today poll which actually predicted the kinds of numbers, and they had the largest sample. They had 7 lakhs or 8 lakh. So what I'm saying is exit polls do not have the intermediation of, for instance, voting machines, electronic voting machines. So exit polls are direct questions that newspapers ask or these media ask. There could be. There could be. I mean, this is not an issue that can be resolved easily. But so that's one reason to be skeptical. And then, I also read, there are people like Yogendra Yadav, who are completely anti-BJP. I mean, they tried to float their own parties. If you read his essay, his interview, that came out a day before the exit polls, he predicts a massive, increase in BJP's strength. And that is based on field research. He went to the field, he walked around, he talked to people, and then he came back and said, it's going to be a disaster this time. And then, that's a very impressive interview because even the exit polls had not come out. And he makes that kind of a prediction. So that is based on field. So I would trust, field level understandings, knowledge. But then, I have heard other people, for instance, Sudha Narayan, she was also in the field, working on food security. She works with John Drez. She wrote to us saying, after the election results came out, she felt totally disconnected from reality, the outcome rather, because, she was actually engaged with the field. So I'm listening to, conflicting reports from the field. But at the same time, exit polls are better than opinion polls. I mean, just as a comparison, they're not perfect, but they're better than opinion polls. In fact, across the world, exit polls tend to do better than opinion polls. Those are my response.
Have to shut the show down. I think there's a lot more questions. We could probably go on for a while. Vamsi's been on his feet for a good 2 hours or more at this point. So thank you so much for coming. I think there's going to be, what this discussion tells me is that we need to follow this up with a lot more systematic programming around the economy. And so we'll strive to do that, that's for sure. So thank you very much, Vamsi. It was brilliant, wonderful. Thank you for being here, and Get yourself your dinner or your cup of chai and samosas upstairs, and see you once again very soon. Thanks.